K.M. Hutton says, men in the 90s were lonely and had low self-esteem too, but they didn't have alt-right podcasts framing and farming their rage to redirect to women in the name of self-help. I don't think K.M. Hutton realizes just how revealing what she said is. Hi, my name is Allison, and these are my adventures on the platform formerly known as Twitter, which I don't want to call X because it's awkward, so maybe Zitter, I don't know. Anyway, I have another doozy of an adventure for you today because we are going to talk about the male loneliness epidemic and people's responses to the male loneliness epidemic. Harris Peskin for Democracy writes, "We may not want to hear it, but this is what the data reflects. There is a massive loneliness epidemic in this country, which is disproportionately affecting men. Instead of calling them incels or mocking them, we should be willing to hear out their concerns." Seems reasonable. If men have an issue, maybe we should talk about it. Maybe we should consider how we might ameliorate it, how we might lessen it, that kind of thing. No, that's not acceptable. This tweet got 1.1 likes and 1.8 comments. So we already know that we're wading into a cesspit. And that cesspit is, as always, don't you dare recognize men as being victims of anything, and don't you dare even hint that women might be responsible. No. Men should take care of each other, but at the same time, they should do so with the oversight and input of women, which isn't incompatible. These two things aren't incompatible. Women should control how men take care of each other, but at the same time, men shouldn't be expected for women to tell them how they are to take care of each other. We'll get into it. It'll get worse. All right. MRW says, and this is a tweet that is much liked, much beloved by the Twitter audience, 9.4 likes. So considerably more appreciated than the original tweet saying, hey, maybe if men are lonely, we should think about their concerns. He responds with, maybe if they stop listening to and repeating Rogan, Tate, Musk, and Peterson, women and regular people would want to talk to them again. Oh, do you think so? Maybe if men shut up, people would listen to them, eh? Yeah, maybe. Or maybe the point is just to get men to shut up. To this, K.M. Hutton replies, this exactly. Husband and I were discussing this. Men in the 90s were lonely, had low self-esteems too, but they didn't have alt-right podcasters farming their rage to redirect at women in the name of self-help. Okay, let's unpack this, right? You're saying that men were lonely in the 90s and they had self-esteem issues in the 90s, okay? Apparently, nobody listened to them 3 decades ago at all. And they didn't talk. They didn't have Rogan and all of these so-called alt-right podcasters then. So what was your excuse then when they didn't have that? What was your excuse to not be listening to them then? Because that's really what it sounds like. It sounds like this is an excuse not to listen to them now, but you don't need an excuse because you didn't listen to them then. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, okay, so they didn't have those podcasters, but you also didn't listen to them then. So what the real problem seems to be is that now lonely and otherwise disenfranchised men have a voice. So you actually have to listen to them. And what, again, you want is for them to be silent. All right? But the other thing is this. So you have known, and presumably other people knew, that men had this problem in the 90s, and you ignored it, and you didn't deal with it. You were happy because apparently you didn't have to hear about it, right? Because they weren't supposedly getting these podcasters weren't getting them to blame women or even talk about it. They were just silent. But here's the thing. They had this problem in the 90s. Did you think maybe you should do something about it? I mean, it's been 3 decades. Men had self-esteem issues in the 90s. 3 decades later, they still have self-esteem issue. No campaigns to try to change that. In the intervening time, we've had plenty of campaigns for women's self-esteem, women's alienation, women's feelings of not being appreciated by the people around them, women's feelings of being ostracized or harassed or attacked. Like all of this, we've had so many campaigns trying to ameliorate the feelings that women have in terms of alienation from the general society. You recognize that men have been feeling this since the 90s, but we've done nothing. Do you think that having their issues ignored for 3 decades might be a cause for anger? I mean, let's imagine, let's just reverse this for a second. KM Hutton, incidentally, she ended up blocking me. Let's reverse this for a second. Let's say that women had a problem in the 90s. They had a problem with their self-esteem. They had a problem with being appreciated by the people around them. You know, they had a problem, right? In the 90s. 3 decades later, nobody has addressed the problem, and they're still blaming women for it, right? They're still saying, well, you just deal with that yourself. It's not our problem, right? And they even take it a step further. Because in the intervening 3 decades, women have got to hear how the society that's ignoring their problems is a society that unfairly advantages them over men. Right? Because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Men aren't just lonely and they're just being left alone. They're also being told that we live in a society that unfairly benefits them over women. And yet they've spent 3 decades having a problem and nobody has thought, hey, maybe we should do something about it. Until these so-called alt-right podcasts. And somehow, every single person talking about this issue and saying, hey, maybe we should do something about it is an alt-right podcast who needs to be silenced. Isn't that funny how that, it's so amazingly convenient that everyone talking about men's issues is immoral and needs to be silenced. Isn't that a convenient thing it's just so, it's so useful, isn't it? So useful. And again, in the 90s, when you weren't listening to men, they also didn't have those podcasts, which you are now using as an excuse for why they're lonely. Like literally, men were lonely in the 90s. They didn't have the alt-right podcasts. But now that they do have the alt-right podcasts, now that's why they're lonely. And none of these individuals step back and say, hey, what are we saying? Does this make any sense? Does this have any logical consistency? Is this something that holds water from sentence to sentence? Because it doesn't. It immediately contradicts itself. And I'm so sorry. I just, this kind of stuff just really gets in my craw because I don't understand how people like this function. You have contradicted yourself. Like he has asserted something. Men are lonely now because they listen to alt-right podcasts. And then Hutton comes in, men were lonely in the 90s, but they didn't have alt-right podcasts. Like, okay, you've just given evidence that the person you've responded to is 100% wrong. And neither of you seem to be acknowledging or recognizing that fact. It's just irrelevant. All right, so KM Hutton goes on. And now post Me Too, where consent is apparently confusing, in a flagging entry-level economy where comparative capability is unnerving, young men are validated by a message that they've lost before they've even tried to look inward because the problem isn't them, it's women. All right. Consent is confusing for the following reason. How do you get someone's consent to approach before you have approached them? Understand that, Hutton? That is the problem. It is inherently confusing and difficult. And the more dangerous you make the initial approach, the more men are going to back off from approaching and or they are going to be confused and angered. Because how do you know if someone wants you to approach them before you have broached the subject of an approach? It is really quite difficult. It is really quite confusing. And what you're essentially saying is you're taking that confusing and difficult thing and you're putting it in a minefield that then men not only have to navigate the confusing and difficult question of how you get consent before you ask for consent, but they also have to navigate all of the horrors of the HR department and losing their job and potentially going to jail if they really screw it up, right? All of that on top of it. Okay? I feel for them. Because that's a lot of shit. And you're just hand-waving it as apparently confusing. No wonder this shit is confusing to you, K.M. Hutton. You are pathologically incapable of understanding male experience. I mean, I don't say that I understand it, but I can sort of put myself in the shoes and walk through it and be like, oh, well, that would really suck. And I can also sort of explain it. You know, I think I have a level of not necessarily true knowledge because I haven't lived it, but an attempt at understanding it. All right, you don't. So it's really funny that you're saying, oh, well, men, you know, if you did X, Y, and Z, I would have compassion for you. No, you wouldn't. If you cut out your tongues, men, I would listen to you. Really? I don't think so. I don't think that's on the table, K.M. Hutton. And then the next thing is entry-level economy where comparative capability is unnerving. All right. We have, as a society, in response to women's requests, and again, remember that minefield? So we take this confusing issue of consent, we put it in a minefield. Who requested the minefield? Who demanded the minefield? Women. Right? Women. And they're giving men no map through it. They're just saying, I want the minefield, and I'm not going to take responsibility for the men who get blown up unfairly by the minefield. But I want that minefield. So women have put the minefield out. They have also requested artificial intervention that elevates them above equivalent men in the employment arena. And we've seen this. There are bursaries, there are scholarship, female only. So they get advantages in academia. We also have teachers, feminist teachers, who apparently literally mark boys worse than girls. So there's advantages all the way through that are unearned by girls. And then when you get into the work world, there are hiring quotas. There are DEI, diversity and inclusion initiatives. There's all kinds of things that privilege female workers over male. And we all asked for that because we wanted to get rid of the wage gap under the assumption that there was some kind of nefarious miasma in the world that was causing women to be earning less. Never proven, by the way. Never proven. There is no indication that anyone wants to privilege men over women. None whatsoever, and in fact, quite the reverse. The gamma bias is very real. All right. So these are things that women have asked for, and they're demanded and have gotten. They have gotten artificial elevation in the employment sphere. They've gotten this entire minefield of things that men have to risk in order to just deal with the question of how do you get consent before you get consent. You know, all of this, women have asked for it and gotten it. And now men have to deal with an unfair employment landscape, and they are still held to the same expectation that they earn more than their spouse, than their female spouse. So it's not necessarily that men have lost before they've even tried. It's that we have done what we said we wanted to do, which is give women artificial elevation in the employment landscape. And we justify it by saying, oh, well, men are, there's bias towards men. That has never been demonstrated to be true. Okay? Maybe the reason why men achieve more in terms of finances is because that's critical for them to actually have a partner. Whatever. And so I respond to K.M. Hutton. So the problem is them. Problem is men. Okay? K.M. Hutton says, the men soothed and validated by alt-right misogynist messaging. Literally, nobody who talks about the concerns of young men in any kind of compassionate or understanding capacity exists outside of the smear of being alt-right. The instant you say Male victims of domestic violence, you're alt-right. The loneliness epidemic among men, you're alt-right. Sexual assault against men, alt-right. False accusations, definitely alt-right. Parental alienation, go sit in the alt-right corner. Like every single person who expresses a concern about men and says, hey, maybe men should be cared about in this capacity and we shouldn't just dismiss it by saying, well, women have it worse. Anything. Even mental health. That used to be the most innocuous way of saying, hey, maybe we should care about men. Mental health. No. You're an alt-right misogynist if you point out that men dying more from depression is a more critical issue than women attempting to kill, to unalive themselves. It might be more critical. If men are dying more often from a disease, maybe we should focus on them. No, that's alt-right. Okay, there's nobody who advocates for men who isn't subject to being called alt-right. So the men soothed and validated by alt-right misogynist messaging. In other words, messaging that men can have problems without being the problem. That's what she means by alt-right messaging. Yes, not all lonely men resolve loneliness with vitriol and bigotry. This is rich, coming from a woman who apparently is incapable of any kind of compassion for men. Not all lonely men equate strength with being crude, and vulnerability and kindness, weakness to be bullied out of each other. Many know better. So this is the appeal to toxic masculinity, to blame men for their own problems. It's profoundly unkind to say that men are the problem when they have problems. Right? That is profoundly unkind. And it's so hilarious to me, just as an aside, how unbelievably easy it is to turn a supposed bleeding heart, leftist, socialist into a dyed-in-the-wool arch conservative by simply bringing up men's issues. Like you notice this with supposed leftists. Oh, well, men might have an issue. Oh, bootstrap that fucker! Get a bootstrap! Blah, 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 blah. Like instantly, you can turn any freaking leftist into a traditionalist. Like not even like, we're, love the sinner, hate the sin kind of gentle Christian soul. No, the kind of traditionalist that cackles after kicking homeless people in the ass and saying, get a job. That kind of traditionalist. You can turn any leftist into that kind of traditionalist by just simply bringing up men's issues. Suddenly, all compassion disappears and everything is on the individual again, huh? Astounding, the level of hypocrisy. All right, so going back to K.M. Hutton. The men soothed and validated by alt-right misogynist messaging, which is any messaging that frames men as having problems, not being the problem. Yes, not all lonely men resolve loneliness with vitriol and bigotry. Not all lonely men equate strength with being crude. You see how she's framing lonely men as a potential problem rather than having a problem? So how you respond to something that is actually extremely painful, men, is what she really has a concern with. Not the initial pain, not any of that. She wants to make sure you respond to it correctly. That's it. You don't have problems, you are the problem. So I respond with, she says, not all lonely men equate strength with being crude, and vulnerability and kindness, weakness to be bullied out of each other. Many know better. Okay, so just translating, because she's associating a lot of stuff with alt-right misogynist messaging. There are lonely men who realize that they are the problem. They don't have a problem. Yes, and those lonely men unalive themselves. Thank you very much, K.M. Hutton. So I respond with, name a vulnerability you believe men have as men because they're men. K.M. Hutton says, I meant emotional vulnerability, like the capacity or the capability to challenge oneself, to feel and process difficult emotions, risk rejection, shame or fear, acknowledge mistakes, etc. That is a very strange definition of vulnerability. I'd like to read the actual definition of vulnerability. Vulnerability, noun. The quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Conservation authorities have realized the vulnerability of the local population. She doesn't understand what vulnerability means. I'm sure she does in the capacity of women. Like if you said women are vulnerable, she would understand that that means women are vulnerable to some external harm. But when you talk about men, that is just completely disappears. Gone. It just sublimates, disappears into the ether, it slips into another dimension. And vulnerability becomes not vulnerability, but the ability to take risk or tolerate risk. Isn't that funny? And it's not the only time that this has happened recently, that I've noticed that when we talk about men, we completely forget the actual definition of the term vulnerability, which is open to external harm. That's it. That's what it means. It doesn't mean being willing to take risks, right? It's not being willing to be open to external harm. It is being open to external harm. And then I respond to that with, so once again, she said, I meant emotional vulnerability, like the capability to challenge oneself, to feel and process difficult emotions, risk rejection, shame, and acknowledge. And I respond with, it is fascinating that you have mistaken stoicism for vulnerability. And she responds with, I am fascinated you think stoicism gets one interpersonally to the same place vulnerability does. They're two totally different concepts, of which I'm not mistaken, nor would I suggest conflating them. The ability to manage risk, to open yourself to risk, the ability to take responsibility for acknowledging mistakes, to risk rejection, shame, or fear, the ability to manage all of that, that is stoicism. The ability to manage your emotions is stoicism, right? That's the definition of stoicism. So that's what I said. Look at what you said. Challenge oneself to feel and process difficult emotions, risk rejection, shame, fear, or acknowledge mistakes, etc. Emotional regulation, risk tolerance, nothing that thinking doesn't make it so. This is the literal definition of stoicism. Sorry for the repeat, but I think it really needs to be said. She doesn't know what vulnerability means. She doesn't seem to know what stoicism means, and she is conflating the two. Again, men having a vulnerability means that they are open to external harm, not that they are willing to open themselves to external harm. That's courage. I mean, courage is actually a better word than stoicism. She's conflating vulnerability and courage when it comes to men. I don't think she would do the same when it comes to women. Is vulnerability in women the willingness to take risks, to open oneself to shame and fear and rejection, and to overcome one's own mistakes? No. So she responds with, they're not the same, nor are they mutually exclusive. Vulnerability and courage. And they can work in tandem with one another. But I'm not sure why you plucked this concept out of a prior post to bicker about its merits, if you closely align with some of its overlapping values. Vulnerability is good. Vulnerability is being open to external harm, not being willing to risk being open to external harm. That is courage. Good grief. Okay, so I respond with, do you believe women challenge themselves to feel and process difficult emotions, risk rejection, shame, or fear, acknowledge mistakes, etc., more than men? Are men more likely to scapegoat women and blame them for problems they face? Are men more likely to scapegoat women and blame them for problems they face? Do men have an entire academic branch devoted to blaming women for the problems they face? The answer is no. But I don't think she got it. So she responded with, yes, I do. So women are more likely to challenge themselves to feel and process difficult emotions, risk rejection, shame, or fear, and acknowledge mistakes relative to men. And they are also less likely to scapegoat men than the reverse. Statistically, no, but circling back to where this convo started, discussing lonely men and how their media having alt-right misogynist messaging might affect their ability to socialize well with women. All right, so but you already pointed out that in the 90s, when there was no misogynist alt-right messaging, women, men were still lonely. All right, well, what was the excuse then? What was the reason for ignoring men in the 90s when they were lonely? It's like this obsession with making sure that men do not externalize anything that they experience, which is why she's misunderstanding the term vulnerability when it comes to men. It's like she's completely decided to go with a definition that is not vulnerability. Again, open to external harm. That is vulnerability. She's talking about courage. So instead of recognizing that men can be open to external harm, she's saying, no, actually, when it comes to men, vulnerability is courage. And love is hate, and peace is war, and also apparently men were lonely in the 90s, but they didn't have alt-right misogynist messaging. But the reason why they're lonely now is because of alt-right misogynist messaging. Because, happy guys, they had tons of friends, tons of girlfriends. They were just living their best life. And then just one day they came across an alt-right podcast and their life changed forever. It just sort of, it's like somebody lurking in a back alley. Hey, dude, you look really happy. Would you like some alt-right? With, like a trench coat. Here's some alt-right. It'll really make you miserable and lonely. Here, don't you want some? Like, good Lord. Where do these people come from? And again, everything that acknowledges that men might be dealing with an external difficulty is considered alt-right misogynist messaging. But you know what? I don't want to put words in her mouth, so I said, could you give me an example of this alt-right misogynist messaging? No answer. And then I said, actually strike that. What are the difficult emotions you presumably think men aren't processing, and where do they come from? Because in the end of all of this, she does reveal something. What are those difficult emotions that she allows that men are having? And where are they coming from? Are men deciding to have difficult emotions? Hey, what is there any external source to those difficult emotions? Are they a response to something that's happening to men? Because I can tell you, men don't generally just walk around and then they're suddenly hit by the difficult emotions bug. Generally, something happens to men from an external source that causes those difficult emotions. At this point, she blocks me. Questions are not allowed. They're misogynist, possibly also alt-right. Definitely part of an alt-right podcast. Would you? I got a great selection of alt-right podcasts. Would you like some? Yeah. I'll just drop some alt-right podcast into men's drinks to get them addicted to your product. Freaking retarded. Okay, so anyway, there was some other additional conversations about how this individual called Restricted says, risk rejection? Why would a man need to risk rejection? It's not in a man's nature to pursue women. We respond to women who show interests. All of you are brainwashed to believe hard to get works. So now you're miserable with weak men. Strong men are alone. And Hutton responds with, I think it's wild that risk rejection must mean sexually. Like that's your immediate context for reading that phrase. I meant vulnerable in an array of contexts. Personally, professionally, creatively, socially. Men encounter women more in more places than the bedroom. I just fucking... The image is this woman just... Guy comes home from a long day's work. Thinks he's single, right? He's just hanging up his coat and his hat, putting his wallet on the console table, and then he just gets himself some ramen noodle and then It's like, I guess I got to go to bed, get up for the grind tomorrow. And then he finds a woman in his bedroom. Men encounter women in more places than the bedroom. Yes, usually they encounter women prior to the bedroom, which in some hopeful cases leads to the bedroom. What the? And I respond with, this was in the context of romantic relationships, wasn't it? It was. Like this entire thing was in the context of a romantic relationship. At least this particular sub-thread was. Anyway. I think part of the problem is this expectation that men's only social value come from their value to women. Like that's part of this issue. And yeah, I guess men can develop the ability to derive social value without women. But women, do you really want that? Like isn't that why you always go in and try to break up men's spaces? Because they might actually do that. Right? They might actually do that. That's why there are women trying to get into like this all male peninsula, Mount Athos, that's been autonomous for 1,000 years, like this monastery that just is men. These monasteries that are just men doing good works for men. And there are women trying to get in there. Women trying to get into every old boys club, because God forbid men develop a sense of social value outside women, and then you turn around and say, why should we have to give you social value? Why do you suffer? Just be alone, be miserable, and have low self-worth. Why should we and don't make it yourself either, because we'll destroy that. It's like it's very unfair, it seems. But of course, that makes me a misogynist alt-right podcaster, to which I say yes. Yes, sure, whatever. I am going to blame women. You can't stop me. I am going to say that it is perfectly fine to blame women. We're going to learn that it's perfectly fine to blame women. We are going to blame women. We're going to be okay with blaming women. And when we are as emotionally comfortable with blaming women as we are with blaming men, then we can talk about how much women are to blame for. And if that makes me a misogynist alt-righter, then so be it. All right. I found this really interesting because it ended up that just almost without any kind of connection, another individual talked about vulnerability and men in the same way. This is from Unsolicited Advice, Philosophy's Urgent Warning to Young Men. And this individual was talking about the hero of our times, which I'm not even going to pronounce. It's a Russian author. Don't make me pronounce it. It's going to be horrible for all of us. But you can look up A Hero of Our Time. And this individual describes vulnerability thusly. Vulnerability also comes a broader idea of how to begin exploring those depths. I submit to you that to be vulnerable is not necessarily to wear your heart on your sleeve, or break down crying in front of your lover. It might instead be just a small act of sincerity, a bid for connection, the courage to wish the good of another people, or commitment to a set of values. Okay. Once again, and he's talking in the context of men. Once again, we have a person misunderstanding what vulnerability means when he's talking about men. Vulnerability is not courage. Vulnerability is open to external harm. Let us not start getting weird with words. Let us keep them with reasonable definitions that resemble the things that they were before all of this shit happened. Okay? That's what vulnerability means. When you recognize vulnerability in men, you recognize that they are open to external harm. And it stops there. They are open to external harm. You don't immediately reframe that as they should be courageous in risking that harm. No, you don't immediately reframe that in terms of, oh, wait, we got to think about the internal processes of the men who are dealing with this external harm. This is the thing. And if you don't actually look into this, then you're doing nothing about changing the way we understand gender. Because this is the big kahuna of gender differences right here. And this misunderstanding of vulnerability when it applies to men. We immediately take vulnerability and we reframe it in terms of risk-taking and courage when it applies to men. When it is simply being open to external harm. Because it is almost impossible for us to see that and say, yeah, men are open to external harm, and not reframe it as an internal failure and a failure of the internal locus of control of a man. And there's so much to this to unpack. And this is something that I have experienced because, again, last video I explained why I present so androgynously on Twitter, why I don't use very feminine usernames. It's because I want to see how women and other men treat men. And then I want to show it to everyone, because when it's directed at a woman, everybody sees how absurd it is. And to explain why, unpack this whole conflation of vulnerability with the word courage when it comes to men. Again, I will tell you about the time that a woman attempted to shame me using her own failures. Like, you're not strong enough as a man to save me from my weaknesses. I'm like, yeah, that's just you saying you're a loser. I don't give a crap. I'm not going to be shamed that way. I am completely indifferent to that. I know men aren't, in many cases. They aren't indifferent to it. If a woman says, you aren't a man enough to save me from myself, they're going to be like, oh, a lot of them are going to be like, oh, well, yeah, you're right. Because not only do we expect men to internalize external forces that act on them, so if an external force acts on a man, he's supposed to internalize it. And if he is a victim of that, becomes his own fault because he was unable to overcome it. Not only do we do that with just external forces acting on men, we do that with external forces acting on women that men can't save them from. And we see it as a failure of men's courage. But we also do it when it's women taking the action. When women are doing something stupid and men don't save them from it, who's to blame? The man. Not the woman doing the stupid thing. Not the woman doing the destructive thing. And that's where all of this shit, men having to wife up women who wait till they're their 40s before they consider settling down, and who've had dozens of sexual partners, who come, they come with baggage, STDs, children. Men have to wife them up despite the fact that they are the ones who made the mistake. This whole dynamic encapsulated in the fact that people mistake courage for vulnerability when you apply the concept to men. Men are supposed to take external things and deal with them internally to overcome them. And that's just not stuff that happens to them. It's stuff that happens to women. But here's the problem. Men are not infinitely powerful. Okay? No offense, guys, but you're not. Right? It's okay to have things that are out of your control. It's, aside from the fact that it's really stressful, period, right? Nobody wants anything out of your control. But there are things that are out of your control. It's out of men's control, and we need to understand that. Right? In particular, one thing that's out of men's control is the social approval of women. And if we as a society are going to say that men are worthless without women's social approval, then how can we then blame men for the destruction of their self-esteem that results when they don't get social approval? Are we going to allow men to just go off and find their own way to create purpose and social approval? No, because we're constantly going to destroy that. We're going to constantly say, no, they can't do that. That's suspicious. They're up to something. Shut that shit down. Right? Well, then, can't have it both ways. Right? And again, men aren't infinitely powerful. They are very, very good at protecting and providing for women and society. They've done an unbelievable job, but they can't do everything. Right? And where men's ability stops, women need to pick up the ball and start doing the work necessary to make sure we have a functional society. And part of that is recognizing that men matter, that men deserve compassion, and that men deserve recognition for everything that they do as men for everybody. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you for your kind attention, and have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, second breakfast, third lunch, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. See ya.